In the recent lessons of our free 2D animation class, I've been walking you through the steps of a professional animation workflow, animating this little jumping monster here. This is how it will look in the end, and this is what we have got so far. Next, we're going to add breakdowns. They are incredibly important in animation because they define which path exactly your motion takes. And they play a huge role in giving your motion a certain kind of flavor. So find out how to take your animation to the next level with breakdowns. This scribble here maps out a very fast pendulum swing. And the breakdown is here in the middle of the motion. Without this frame, it will look like the pendulum just slides over in a straight line. And even if we added another ease like here and here, the motion path would still seem rather flat and not exactly like a curve. For pendulum, it's just a realistic choice to have it dip down in the middle of the motion. But for other motions, you have some creative freedom here. For example, with a head turn, it can be a huge difference if you have a dip down or a dip up, or like a combination of two, like an S-curve. They give you motions with a vastly different feel to it because of vastly different motion paths. So the breakdown defines the peak of a curve, the highest, lowest, leftmost, or rightmost point of a motion path. Later, when we're going to add the in-betweens to a lot of those poses, we're gonna add an ease out, meaning we increase the spacing gradually to have the motion pick up speed gradually, or we are going to decrease the spacings gradually, slowing the motion down, which gives us an ease into that pose. This gives main poses like this one and this one a couple of frames like that one and that one that look very similar to the frame that they're either coming out of or going into. So most of the poses we designed so far linger a little bit longer on screen because of the previous and the following frames being very similar to them. But with the breakdown, that's a different story. The spacing before and after very often is the largest of the entire motion. There is literally only one frame to see that position of the ball. So although breakdowns are incredibly important for the motion path, they are seen very, very briefly. So what kinds of things can you put into that split second that make your animation truly awesome? Let's have a look at a couple of examples. We start with the breakdown between the starting position and the bend down for the anticipation of the jump. For the head, it's very important to not move it in a straight line because that bow comes from the spine and that spine gives you that curve in the motion automatically. So the head is traveling in an arc here. And what I'm doing here for the body volume is actually the most boring thing that you can do in a breakdown. When you switch on onion skin and you see the previous line in red and the next frame in green, and all you do is going exactly in the middle. This is often the most boring choice you can make for a breakdown, but in this case, there's not much else to do, not much other information that we need to put in there other than, okay, this is just the middle of the volume expanding in that direction. And just with the 2 or 3 most important volumes penciled in, we can already flip through it and test if we like the breakdown. The cool thing of checking that in this state is that you didn't draw a detailed breakdown. It's just a couple of shapes. If you want to throw them away, start over, experiment, try something else, you can do that without losing a detailed drawing. You're just testing different motion paths and different ideas with rough shapes. And in this case, I'm content with how these 2 volumes behave and I keep them, but you see me in a later pose where I decide that I want the path of the head to be different. And that would be a thing that you can test now. As I've done many times before, I take the trident from a previous frame, make sure to mark where exactly the hand holds the trident. You don't want that point to slide, otherwise it won't be believable that he has a firm grip on the trident. And I kind of put it exactly in the middle, but if you think of location and rotation independently, you can see that the location of the hand is kinda exactly in the middle, but the rotation is still very similar to the starting position. So the location is exactly in the middle, the rotation is eased because it's closer to the starting point. And this is one of the most mind-bending aspects of animation, that physical properties of motion often are independent from each other. Even with just the position alone, moving something along the y-axis and moving something along the x-axis is independent from each other. You could have an ease on the y-axis while the x-axis is moving at constant speed, just forward. And this sort of multi-dimensional thinking is very difficult for the human brain. I'm not so sure that I fully grasp it, that I fully understand it. I actually should make a video about that at some point. But for now, I think just remember the simplified version, that rotation and position can move independently from each other. One can ease while the other one might not. Just like how I could spin a fidget spinner on my finger and then move my finger and the fidget spinner would just keep spinning independently. Next, I put in the facial features pretty much exactly in the middle. I take the ears from a previous frame. I don't have them being like dragged behind, flopping behind, because I want them to feel a little bit stiff. For the arm and the hand, I refer back to the model sheet to see how exactly I wanted the fingers to look. And I decide to put in this very big curve, which is kind of a point of interest in this whole animation now, because neither the starting pose nor the end pose has a curve in it. This is something that makes emotion more complex. If you go from something that didn't have an angle to an angle and then back to no angle again, I like that little detail in the motion, and it also drags the eye over to the right side of the character. For the tail, I don't want this tail poof feather thing to be exactly in the boring middle. In this case, I really want to cash in on the drag and follow through and have it point in the direction where it comes from. If you want to know more about drag and follow through, we have an extra video about that and the physics behind it. Now you see me flipping through the animation, and I actually correct the tail a couple of times because I wasn't quite happy with the angle. This is something very common if you put in an element that is being dragged behind, that you try different angles, you try different, like how strong is it being pulled behind, how much stiffness does it still have in it. This is something where you should really try different possibilities because it changes the feel of the motion a lot. The next breakdown pose that we are going to design sits between the anticipation on the ground and the highest point of the jump. And this is a very interesting one because it's in the middle of quite a fast motion. So we get to have some fun here and really set the flavor for the jump. But before we go on, let me tell you, one of the best ways to make a living with animation is to work for companies and create explainer videos or logos. I have a premium tutorial where you learn how to create this logo animation from scratch in OpenToonz. Whether you are a freelancer and you want to add motion design as a service for your clients, or you're just really curious about animation and you want to experiment some more, this motion design course is your ticket to get started with the fundamentals. But if motion design isn't something you're interested in, don't worry, we also have more character animation tutorials. For example, how to animate these two fellas here. And in this particular tutorial, you will also learn a lot about the basics of physics that you can use every day in your character animation. So if these topics sound interesting to you, please consider joining these classes. It really supports this channel a lot if you do so. The links are in the description. And now back to the tutorial. The biggest decision we have to make here is how far up we want the body to already be. And this touches on a very interesting aspect of breakdowns. A breakdown doesn't have to be in the middle, neither timing-wise nor space-wise. If we put the body in this breakdown already very far up, maybe even almost there at the peak of the jump, we will get a jump that snaps up into the air with like a huge leap. If you put it somewhere in the middle, we don't claim that this monster can have like all this jump energy that shoots it so far up, and it looks like a more realistic jump. I decided to do a little bit of a combination of the two here. I put the body volume almost exactly in the middle, and the head is already almost there, like 3/4 to the top. And this stretches his body a lot, makes him almost like 1.5 heads taller. If you are going for a very cartoony style, this is the moment where you can really stretch the body to your heart's content and also do funny things like smears where you just elongate body parts or eyes or whatever unnaturally. There's also something called multiples. If you have like a very fast head turn, for example, an animator could draw multiple eyes just during that one fast smear frame, and it will just feel fast and wacky and like motion blur. Just make sure that you're keeping the volume. And, you know, if you don't keep the volume, if you're just doing some smear fun, then it needs to look like it's motion blur. It needs to follow the path of that motion, and it cannot be beside it. I guess stretches, smears, and multiples also deserve their own video at some point, but yeah, that's that, just so that you've already heard of that. And once again, I flipped through the animation to see how it feels. You should maybe experiment a bit more than what I'm doing here. Really grab your breakdown, put it a little higher, a little lower, and just notice how it starts to feel different. One important thing to keep in mind with regards to eyes is that during fast motions, most creatures close their eyes out of reflex. So oftentimes during the breakdown, the eyes are closed. This is something you can sprinkle into almost any breakdown that is in the middle of fast motion, and it will make your creature feel more alive and natural. In this case, the eyes were already closed, but I just wanted to mention it because that is something that happens a lot in fast motions. So for the trident, I would imagine that it is made of metal, so it's definitely dragging down the arm to its fullest extent and pointing down as much as it can in the wrist. For a little bit of contrast, I tried to treat the other arm differently, not having it point straight down, but already have it in the middle of being raised, because in the key pose at the top, the arm is raised. But then later I abandoned that idea and I just had the other arm also point straight down, because I feel like this gives the drag more of an impact. It feels even faster, and the character has to get into like this really streamlined shape, which I think feels really cool in the middle of the motion here. Oh, and by the way, have a look at the tail. Notice how it is being dragged along a motion path, and it's just swooping through that path. Now let's jump directly to the next breakdown, and it's a little bit like the previous one, because now it's the way down from the peak. And interestingly, I placed the breakdown pretty much exactly where I had it on the way up. There are cases where the way down looks vastly different than the way up. For example, if you have a very heavy character, the way up could be a lot more like if a big orc is lifting a fist or like a big stone hammer from the ground, it might take a lot of work to get it off the ground, but the way down is a lot faster because you just need to have gravity kick in, and consequently the breakdown could already be a lot further. But in our case, we're probably going to have the same spacing pattern on the way down, so I use onion skinning to meet that position pretty much exactly. And then I tried to spice it up a little bit in the head by having like a 3-dimensional turn up. Never underestimate how much a slight head rotation can spice up your animation, especially if it's not just leaning. Like leaning is already super cool, but if you make it a little bit 3-dimensional, it can really add a visual richness to your animation. And the rest of this pose is all about stuff being dragged behind. We kind of now have the opposite situation of what we had before, because the character in the pose before was coming from the ground. Everything that was dragged behind was pointing towards the ground. And now that the monster is coming down from the top, the drag direction reversed, and everything that is lagging behind is pointing upwards to that peak. The tail is kind of mirroring that motion path of the jump. It's so long that it didn't already flip over in its entirety. For this last breakdown, we are also kind of reminded of the first breakdown that we did. And at first I treated it the same. I had the head going up in an arc and the belly mass just coming back to its model shape. But somehow I felt like this wasn't goofy enough. This motion was missing a little edge, a little detail. So I decided to try to reverse the curve. That is something that you can always do with breakdowns. Just experiment, like, what if I would go in the other direction? And sometimes it might feel insane. Like, why would this character hit in a curve that goes inward? But then maybe you get an idea for like a spin smash or something like that. I don't know. I'm just making stuff up. But sometimes there's a time for interesting, unusual motion paths, and just as well as sometimes there's no time for that, where it just should be the path that everybody is expecting because there's already so much other stuff going on. So yeah, I invert the curve. Now the character's kind of like going back while he's getting up. And I just love that position in the middle. Like, I imagine like he gets a little bit of a double chin when he like puts his head into his body mass. I like how it gives you more of like a spring up. Like the other one was more like a controlled, like I just bent up again. And the other one is more like a spring loaded one because it's coming from below him and makes the breakdown on the x-axis already very close to where it's going to end up. And I don't know, somehow that always reminds me of a spring. The trident in this pose is interesting because it is contacting the ground at the bottom, and when he's leaning back, it's pivoting around that point at the bottom, and you also have the hand connecting to it. So you have a kind of interesting system here where things are locked in place. The hand is locked on the trident is locked on the point in the ground, and it just sets some constraint to the motion of the trident that we didn't have previously. Yeah, now we add the other bits and pieces. A lot of them is still being dragged behind gently, the ears, the arms, and of course the tail is also pointing in the direction it came from. Here you can see our animation with the breakdowns in it, and isn't this already coming to life? Isn't it crazy how many important animation decisions we crammed into the poses just by designing them? One big aspect is still missing. We didn't do any timing yet. That is coming up next. But first, I have to thank my Patreon supporters. Thanks to them, I can make long classes and tutorials like this one. If you enjoy this type of content and you want to help me so I can have more time making it, please consider supporting me on Patreon as well. We also have a group mentoring tier, which will give you access to a monthly group mentoring call to which you can bring anything you're currently working on. An animation, an animatic, a story idea, or just a drawing or painting, and I can critique it, draw over it, give you tips and tricks on how to make it better and strategies on how to improve your skills in general. Getting feedback from a professional and advice on how to fix mistakes is one of the fastest ways to grow. So if you want my input, I'll feel honored if you join our group mentoring on Patreon. In any case, thank you so very much for watching. I hope you will stick around for the next part. Subscribe and like and all this good stuff, and keep on animating.